Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you agreed to something you didn't really want? Or found yourself influenced by someone's words in ways you couldn't quite explain? Chances are you've experienced the subtle power of linguistic manipulation, language patterns specifically designed to bypass your critical thinking. These techniques aren't magic or mind control, but they're remarkably effective because they exploit how our brains naturally process language. What makes them particularly powerful is that they operate largely beneath our conscious awareness. By the time you realize what's happening, the suggestion has already taken root in your mind. Today, I'm going to reveal some of these dark language patterns, explain how they work, and most importantly, show you how to defend yourself against them. Knowledge is your best protection. Once you can recognize these techniques, they lose much of their power over you. Let's start with embedded commands, one of the most common linguistic manipulation techniques. These are directives disguised within seemingly innocent statements, delivered in a way that your unconscious mind registers the command, while your conscious mind focuses on the larger message. Consider the difference between these two statements. Sign the contract versus, I'm wondering if you'll find yourself ready to sign the contract today. The first is a direct command that triggers natural resistance. The second embeds the command, sign the contract, within a longer, softer statement. Your conscious mind processes the whole sentence, while your unconscious registers the embedded directive. Politicians and advertisers use this technique constantly. When a politician says, when you think about it carefully, you'll vote for me in November, they've embedded the command, vote for me, in a statement your conscious mind processes as a simple prediction. These embedded commands become even more powerful when accompanied by subtle shifts in voice tone, tempo, or with physical markers like hand gestures that unconsciously highlight the embedded suggestion. A skilled manipulator might slightly lower their voice or pause briefly before delivering the embedded command, marking it as significant to your unconscious mind without your conscious awareness. Another version of this technique is the embedded question. Instead of directly asking, will you buy this product? A salesperson might say, many people wonder how quickly they'll start to see results after they buy this product. The question of whether you'll buy it bypasses critical thinking because it's presupposed in the statement about results. Speaking of presuppositions, they represent another powerful linguistic tool that can bypass critical thinking. Presuppositions are assumptions embedded within statements that must be accepted as true for the statement to make sense. They're particularly effective because challenging them requires interrupting the flow of conversation to question the underlying assumption. For example, if someone asks, would you prefer to schedule your next appointment for Tuesday or Thursday? They've presupposed that you've already decided to have another appointment. To reject this presupposition, you have to backtrack and address the assumption rather than simply answering the question as framed. The beauty of presuppositions for manipulators is that they slip past our critical filters. Our brains naturally focus on responding to the explicit question rather than examining the embedded assumptions. By the time we might think to question these assumptions, we've already implicitly accepted them. Some of the most powerful presuppositions include time-based assumptions like before you sign up or after you make your purchase, which presuppose you will take those actions. Awareness presuppositions like you've probably noticed the benefits presuppose the benefits exist and you've observed them. And awareness of change. Presuppositions like you're becoming more interested presuppose a process is already underway. You see these techniques everywhere in marketing. When you experience the comfort of our mattress, presupposes you will experience it. You'll be amazed by how quickly you see results. Presupposes results exist, and you'll see them. Once you start noticing these patterns, you'll be shocked by how frequently they appear in everyday, persuasive language. Loaded questions represent another powerful technique for bypassing critical thinking. These questions contain assumptions that direct your thinking in specific ways regardless of how you answer. The classic example is, have you stopped beating your dog? Whether you answer yes or no, you implicitly accept the presupposition that you were beating your dog. In more practical settings, a salesperson might ask, is this the first time you've experienced such exceptional customer service? Either answer accepts the presupposition that the service was exceptional. Or a manager might ask, is there any other reason besides budget constraints why we shouldn't move forward with this project? This presupposes budget constraints are already accepted as a reason, and frames the discussion toward finding reasons not to proceed rather than evaluating whether to proceed at all. The power of these questions comes from their ability to constrain thinking within a particular frame. Even if you reject the explicit question, the embedded assumption often goes unchallenged and affects subsequent thinking. Manipulators also use linguistic patterns that create complex equivalences, statements that link unrelated things as if one necessarily implies the other. You're hesitating, which means you don't trust me, is a complex equivalence. Hesitation could indicate many things: careful consideration, uncertainty, or simply needing more information. But this statement attempts to make you feel that your hesitation equals distrust, potentially pressuring you into a decision to prove you do trust the speaker. These patterns become particularly insidious when combined with mind-reading statements, where the manipulator claims to know what you're thinking or feeling. I can tell you're skeptical, which means you're not seeing the big picture, combines mind-reading with a complex equivalence to doubly bypass your critical thinking. Another powerful linguistic pattern involves the strategic use of cause-effect relationships, where one thing is presented as inevitably leading to another. As you listen to my voice, you'll find yourself becoming more comfortable with this decision, links the simple act of listening, which you're already doing, with becoming comfortable with a decision. The as-you-you'll pattern is particularly effective because it ties ongoing realities to suggested outcomes. Temporal language patterns like before, during, after can similarly bypass critical thinking by presupposing a specific sequence of events. After you make your purchase, you'll understand why so many people love this product. Presupposes you will make the purchase and subtly discourages questioning the decision beforehand. Then there's the not command, which paradoxically introduces ideas while seemingly negating them. When someone says, "Don't think about a blue elephant," what immediately happens? You picture a blue elephant. Similarly, when a salesperson says, "I'm not going to pressure you into making a decision today," they've introduced the concept of making a decision today while appearing to do the opposite. This works because our brains process the instruction before applying the negation. We must first entertain a concept before we can negate it. Skilled manipulators leverage this cognitive quirk to plant ideas while appearing to be doing the opposite. Perhaps the most subtle linguistic manipulations involve the strategic use of vague language that invites the listener to fill in the gaps. Phrases like "this powerful information" or "that important feeling" don't specify what information or feeling is being referenced, requiring you to supply your own meaning. Since you're generating the specific content, it feels more relevant and persuasive than if the speaker had provided it. Milton Erickson, a pioneer in hypnotherapy, mastered this technique. He understood that vague language forces the listener's mind to work harder, searching for personal meaning and thereby becoming more engaged with the suggestion. When someone says, "As you consider this opportunity, you might notice that feeling of certainty growing," the vague references to opportunity and feeling of certainty compel you to assign personal meaning to them. All these techniques become exponentially more powerful when chained together. Consider this seemingly innocent statement. I'm not going to suggest you'll immediately recognize the value of this offer, but as you think about it more deeply, before making your final decision, you might become aware of that growing sense of excitement about the possibilities. This single statement contains multiple manipulative patterns. The not command, introducing the suggestion of immediate recognition, a cause-effect relationship as you think you might become. A temporal presupposition before making your final decision presupposes you will make a decision. And vague language, that growing sense of excitement that forces you to supply personal meaning. These dark language patterns aren't just theoretical concepts. They're actively used in politics, marketing, sales, and unfortunately, in manipulative personal relationships. The person who says, "After everything I've done for you, you're still questioning my intentions," is using presuppositions, "everything I've done for you." In complex equivalences, questioning equals ingratitude, to manipulate emotionally. So how can you protect yourself from these linguistic manipulations? The first step is exactly what you're doing right now, becoming aware of these patterns. Once you can recognize them, their effectiveness dramatically decreases. When you hear an embedded command or notice a presupposition, you can consciously choose whether to accept it rather than allowing it to bypass your critical thinking. Second, practice questioning presuppositions. When someone asks, "Would you prefer the gold or platinum package?" respond with, "I haven't decided if I want either package yet." This habit of identifying and challenging hidden assumptions will significantly strengthen your resistance to linguistic manipulation. Third, pay attention to how language makes you feel. A subtle pressure or urge to comply often signals that manipulative language patterns are at work. When you notice this feeling, pause and ask yourself, what assumption am I being asked to accept here? What decision is being presupposed? Fourth, be particularly vigilant in high-pressure or emotional situations. These are contexts where our critical thinking is already compromised, making us more susceptible to linguistic manipulation. Sales environments, negotiations, or heated emotional discussions are prime territories for these techniques. It's worth noting that these same language patterns aren't inherently unethical. Many of these techniques are used therapeutically by clinical hypnotherapists to help patients bypass limiting beliefs or harmful thought patterns. The ethical dimension comes from the intent and consent. When used without consent to manipulate someone against their interests, these patterns become problematic. The ethical considerations around these techniques are complex. On one hand, all communication aims to influence in some way. Persuasion itself isn't inherently unethical. On the other hand, bypassing someone's critical thinking to influence them without their awareness or consent, particularly to their detriment, crosses ethical boundaries. Perhaps the most reasonable ethical guideline is transparency of intent. If the purpose of the influence is hidden from the person being influenced, particularly when it conflicts with their best interests, the use of these techniques becomes questionable at best and manipulative at worst. Consider how differently we might view these techniques when used by a therapist helping a patient overcome anxiety versus a scammer convincing an elderly person to divulge financial information, or a manipulative partner establishing psychological control. The techniques themselves are similar, but the context, intent, and outcome create the ethical distinction. For those in persuasion professions, sales, marketing, leadership, the ethical use of these language patterns requires ensuring that the influence serves the genuine benefit of the person being influenced. This aligns influence with service rather than exploitation. As we become more aware of how language can bypass critical thinking, we might wonder about the broader implications for society. In an age of information warfare, where linguistic manipulation happens at scale through digital media, the ability to recognize and resist these techniques becomes not just a personal skill, but a civic necessity. Political messaging, advertising, and media of all kinds use these techniques extensively. The person who understands how language can bypass critical thinking gains significant advantage in navigating this landscape of influence attempts. They can make more conscious choices rather than being unconsciously directed. Beyond mere defense, understanding these patterns can help you communicate more effectively in positive ways. Clear, ethical communication that respects the autonomy of others while still being persuasive is possible. By removing hidden presuppositions and being transparent about your aims, you can influence without manipulation. The study of these language patterns ultimately reveals something profound about human cognition. Our brains process language in largely unconscious ways, automatically accepting frames, assumptions, and suggestions without our awareness. This cognitive feature evolved to facilitate efficient communication, but like many evolutionary adaptations, it creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited. But knowledge creates power. By understanding these dark patterns, you reclaim agency over how language affects you. You move from being unconsciously influenced to consciously choosing which influences to accept. In a world saturated with persuasive communication, this awareness is nothing short of essential. So the next time you find yourself inexplicably drawn to a particular decision or feeling unusually compliant in a conversation, pause and ask yourself, is my critical thinking being bypassed? What linguistic patterns are at work here? This simple habit of awareness might be your most powerful defense against the dark arts of linguistic manipulation.